So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of How I Did It, Women Executing Their Ideas. This new program features members of the Boston Club who have accomplished things many of us dream about doing, but haven't figured out how to achieve those dreams. In our hour together, we will provide you with a brief introduction to our guests before diving into their unique accomplishments, take a few questions, and then discuss a few key takeaways for each program. We plan to introduce you to one of these amazing women every other month and welcome your ideas on fascinating topics to explore. Today's guest is Roberta Madison. Roberta helps leaders achieve dramatic improvements in employee engagement, retention, productivity, and profitability. She is the president and founder of Madison Consulting, where she works with Fortune 500 companies and mid-sized emerging companies to create teams that achieve extraordinary results. Known globally as the talent maximizer, she's a seasoned speaker and the author of 5 books and blogs for Fast Company, Glassdoor, Forbes, Thrive, and Thrive Global. She's frequently cited in national media, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Chicago Tribune, Inc.com, WashingtonPost.com, and NPR. Her most recent book, Can We Talk, which is a gorgeous book, 7 Principles for Managing Difficult Conversations at Work, was released at the end of September. She's also one of the few guests who have emerged intact from an appearance on the Bill O'Reilly Show. I promise you, Roberta, we have a more receptive audience here today. Welcome, and thank you for sharing your experience and expertise with us. I'd like to get started by having you give us a brief overview of your background, since that plays a significant role in how you came to be a published author. So with that, I'd love to have you take it away.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. It's actually 6 books. So if any of you have written a book, you know that every book counts. So I don't want to leave any book off the table here. It's an interesting question. I started my career when I started my leadership journey when I was 24 years old, and I was suddenly in charge. And my boss had been fired. And the next day I went into her boss's office and asked for her job, and they gave it to me. And I was the head of a commercial real estate company's human resource department. And I remained in that role for 6 years. I was on the executive team. I was in the executive suite, and I learned so many lessons from that experience, which is what I used in my first book, Suddenly in Charge. Managing up, managing down, succeeding all around. And the biggest lesson that I learned is if you don't manage up, you won't have to worry about managing down. So, I've moved into other executive roles, and about 20 plus years ago, I stepped out and started my own consulting practice. And that's what I'm doing today. And as part of that, in order to build my business and build my brand and my credibility, I have, gotten book deals and have published 6 books.
So Roberta, can you tell us a little bit about your latest book, Can We Talk? 7 Principles for Managing Difficult Conversations at Work. I've run through the index and started the first chapter, and I have to admit, as a mediator for disputes that often arise in the workplace, this is heaven sent. And I'm going to be sending this out to a lot of different people as sort of, you may want to have your clients take a look at this.
Thank you. In my coaching practice, the one thing that I noticed is that if issues weren't addressed, they only got worse, right? And what was interesting is I wrote this book during the pandemic, which was actually a good thing, because a lot of the conversations that in the past I would have advised people, do not do that on Zoom, or do not pick up the phone and have that conversation, have it in person. That was no longer an option. So when I wrote the book, I made sure that, look, ideally, it would be great if you could have this in person, but if you can't, here are some things to consider. And when I also wrote this book, I found in my research, and when I wrote my proposal, my book proposal, which we'll talk about more, the process, that there really weren't any books out there for difficult conversations for, let's say, an employee who needs to have that kind of conversation with their boss or their peer. And so I made a decision that this book would not just be for leaders, but it would be for anyone who needed to address a difficult conversation up, down, and across the organization.
Great. So you've mentioned before that your writing came out of your professional career, and one thing that I know a number of people who are on the call are interested in talking about is what's that process look like? And when you and I were talking and planning, you actually asked a question that came before that, which is, should you write a book? So could you tell us why the process of writing a book really starts with that question?
Well, you have to know what your objectives are, because a lot of people, they think about writing a book and they think, oh, this is great, I'm going to be an author. And then they go through all this work and either they don't follow the guidelines, which are required for a commercially published book. And so they find out that their fully written book can't be published because most publishers won't take a fully written book on. And so, today there are many decisions, and that is, do I want to write a commercially published book? Am I going to self-publish? Am I going to do a hybrid situation? And then what are my objectives? We were talking earlier before, the call officially started, and some people on this call are going to be writing fiction. And so that is not my area of expertise. And so it's a different genre and a different approach, but you've got to know what you want to do. So for me, the books that I write they're big business cards, and they are social proof, and they put me in a position where I do a lot of speaking, and people love to, have authors on the platform. But you have to ask yourself these questions, because you got to figure out, is anyone going to buy my book, right? Because it's a lot of work. And some of you, if you're thinking about writing books because you want to leave a legacy for your children, that's great. Maybe you want to do something that's self-published and you can have them printed on Amazon and give 10 copies out. But if you think you're going to write a book and then all of a sudden everyone's going to buy it, that's a whole different story.
So tell us a little bit about that distinction between the commercial route, which you took, and the self-publishing route. What does it take to go from concept to publication in that commercial context?
Well, the first thing you have to have is a platform, meaning who's gonna be interested in your book, and it goes back to that social proof. Like, how many connections do you have on LinkedIn? How many followers do you have? How frequently are you quoted? What major organizations have you worked for, or are you working for, with clients? What's the visibility here? Because my agent said to me when I was trying to refer people to her, she said, I don't care if they're writing the next War and Peace. If they don't have a platform, I'm not interested. And today's publishers, man, they want to see that you can sell minimum 10,000 books. And I got to tell you, that's a lot of books. So, you have to figure out how to position yourself to prove, like, one of the people on the call said they work for Dell. Well, Dell will commit to buying 1,000 copies, right? All right, now we got to figure out how we're going to sell 9,000 more. And that's really hard for us people who are consultants, because we're not really in the book selling business, right? We want to sell our services. So there's that fine line, like, if you want a second book deal, you better darn well prove that you can sell. So there's a lot of that going on. Some people choose to go the self-publishing route, and that was never something that I considered, because I just felt like when I stood up there, I didn't want my book to say, Maple Ridge Press, which was my street. But today I think that's changing. And so I am kind of changing my thought on that, because when you do self-publish, you can control the pricing. And when you can control the pricing, you can control, where you rank in Amazon. And there are some other things that you can do to get your book noticed, which for me, I have no control over the pricing.
And I would think that if you are going that self-published route where you have more control over the pricing, that may be an opportunity for you to use the book in different ways as well. Can you comment on restrictions that you may bump into as a commercial author versus someone who's self-published?
Yes. Well, first I want to say there are a lot of pieces to this self-publishing thing. Okay. And many of them I am simply not interested in. Okay. So the advantage of having a publisher is like they do it all, right? And I'm not writing books to make money on the books. If I make $1 a copy, I don't know. Is that a lot? I don't even care. My book is so that somebody's going to write me a 6-figure check or say, get me this person. That I don't want to sell 100,000 books to make $100,000. That's just, for me, not good business. But, in terms of the self-publishing, if you can just do print on demand, right? And so if you have a client and they want 200 books, you can just go online and, print them out. So, but I would advise anybody who's considering writing and self-publishing that they really invest in what's called a developmental editor. And that's somebody who will help you frame the book. I hired one for my book, Evergreen Talent. I found that I was struggling because I started to write the book and then I paused. And when you have a commercially published book, you have a contract. And those of you who are on this call who are lawyers know what that means. And that means you have to deliver. And they don't care. They don't want to know that you just, you were blocked. And I just felt like I was lost. And I hired this woman who really helped me create what I thought was a really solid book and 10 times better than where I was headed. So even if you self-published, I would strongly advise you to, invest in those kind of resources.
Where do you find, if you are looking at investing in a development editor, where do you go look for them if you don't have a commercially available publisher who presumably has a list of resources for you to use?
Well, you would ask your friends. I have the name of someone. If anyone's interested, they can, email me and I'll share who I used. But I would ask people who have written books, like, who did you use? And a developmental editor is different than an editor. They're not going to go in there and fix your commas and your, your lack of commas in my case. They're not going to do that for the most part. They're going to say, you realize that in chapter 8, you told that story and now you're telling it again in chapter 10. I'm like, really? You've told the same story twice, or I think that story would be better suited for chapter 2 and it will lay the book out better. So that's the kind of conversation that your development editor would have with you.
Okay, great. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of the writing. Where do you get your inspiration from?
I just want to back up for a moment, because those of you who are considering writing a commercially published book, you have to write a book proposal. That's how you will get a book deal. So if you're interested, there's a great book that I used. It's called Writing the Perfect Book Proposal by Jeff Herman, who also is an agent. And he just lays it out, the format and how to structure this, because you don't go to your publisher or to your agent with a fully written book. So I just want to say that. So your question was, where do I find the inspiration? Is that
right?
Okay. Well, I'm very fortunate in that I work for myself, which means that I am unfiltered. And I look around and every day I see stuff happening. And so I am never for a lack of a vision or words. And I can call it out because I'm not afraid that my boss is going to go, are you serious? You just put that up. So I write the way I speak, very direct, very much storytelling. I tell my own stories of where I failed and what happened to me. And I hope it doesn't happen to you. So my inspiration is really all around.
Okay, so your inspiration comes from your work, and once you have a spark of an idea, what do you do next with that idea?
Well, I write my book proposal. For example, my first book was Suddenly in Charge, and my publisher asked me to write a second book, and that was Talent Magnetism. And after I wrote Talent Magnetism, something that's kind of interesting is I don't actually read my books until they're done, until I'm finished writing them. I thought, wow, this whole key to keeping talent is really about magnetic leadership. So my next book proposal was The Magnetic Leader. So how do you become the kind of leader that sticks to, people want to stick to? So I kind of keep an eye on what's going on in the world. I wrote Evergreen Talent when you couldn't hire people. And that book came out in February of 2020. And in March of 2020, who cared, right? Nobody cared about hiring people. We wanted to keep people safe. So that was a disaster. But now I'm doling those books out like Tic Tacs. But I had to move on. And that's why I was like, okay, this cannot be my swan song.
Right.
If this is the last book I write, this cannot be the way I go out. So that's when I came up with Can We Talk? Because I saw, man, there are just so many conversations not happening.
So how do you build your writing practice into your incredibly busy consulting and coaching career? You've got a zillion things on your plate. How do you manage to build a writing practice into your daily, weekly, or monthly structure?
Well, I schedule it like anything, right? And again, as you know, as a lawyer, once you sign that contract, this last book had to be 64,000 words. That's a lot of words. I'm like, really? You think anyone's going to read that many words? No. Like, okay, I'll write 64,000 words. And, then you parse that down, right? Okay, well, how many words is that a week? And then you're like, okay, so I need to write, 5 pages sitting. And I'm going to do that every other day. And you got to know when is your moment. I wrote Suddenly in Charge when I had 2 small children. And I wrote it from 9 p.m. until midnight, because that was the only time people weren't asking me for food. So I wrote it at night. Now when I write, typically I'll write in the morning before anything goes on, but my kids are at college. I can do that. So you got to find your moment.
Do you recommend, or have you found it to be useful to write at the same time every day? Or is it just a function of when that time fits into your schedule?
Well, I think it's when the time fits into your schedule. But I think for me, if I have it blocked out from 8:30 to 9:30, I'm less likely to, at 2 o'clock when things didn't go as planned, I'm less likely to go, well, okay, I'm not going to write today because it's, 2:30 and I haven't gotten to this. So for me, now it's like first thing. But the key to my writing and my ability to write so quickly is I don't filter myself. And so when I say that I don't read my books until they're done, I don't go back and go, well, should I use this word or that word? I'm like, I don't care. I'm just going to write, and I have editors. And so if my grammar's not perfect, I'm not like going in going, well, should there be a comma here? Or so I just let it rip. And then after, at the end, it gets edited and we fix it.
So talk about that process of editing. And for you, it sounds like you basically create a first draft and then go back and take a look. How many drafts do you go through before it gets to the editor? What happens once it gets to the editor? And just generally, what's that process like?
It's very painful. Especially when you're like me and you don't care where the commas go. It's very painful because then when you get it back, you're like, oh, I have to approve all these changes. But I will write the book and then I'll go back and read it that one time. And then I'll make some changes and adjustments, and then I send it off to the editor, because I know that they're gonna put their, magic on it. And then they come back to you and they're like, okay, well, here's, we want you to fill this in. This story doesn't make sense. You have, your grammar isn't correct here, whatever. They'll go through and do that. And then I have to go through line by line, whatever they're asking, and approve whatever changes they're making. And then it comes back to you again. And then you're like, oh my God, I have to read this again. So it's a lot of work, right?
How long does that process generally take from the time you put pen to paper? And you mentioned that you've got a contract and you're under certain deadlines. What's the typical length of the entire process from that initial draft proposal all the way through the time that it's actually approved and ready for print?
Well, most publishers will give you 6 months. I'm a overachiever, and I've always delivered in 5 months. Because I'm
That
like,
doesn't.
something could happen, right? Like, I don't know. I got to get this done.
That's a lot of words, 64,000 words in 6 months. That's a little less than 11,000 words per month. That's that's a lot of writing.
I know. And if you self-publish, if I were self-published, I wouldn't write a 64,000 word book. I'd write a 50,000 word book, which you guys would love. And you'd.
So when you are a subject matter expert and focus your books around a particular subject matter expertise, is it important to have sort of the bona fides that you mentioned before, having been, having a certain number of LinkedIn followers who acknowledge your expertise on a subject? How does that all play into how you go out and market and sell the book?
Okay, yes, of course, that definitely goes into play. But before I answer that, I just want to say one thing, because I don't want to give people the illusion that you just sit down and start writing, 64,000 words, and when you stop where to start. It was recommended to me on my first book, and I was like almost in tears, that you create an outline. I was like, really? Because I like to just say what I want to say. And that was the best recommendation I had been given, because then when you stop writing, okay, now I'm going to talk about this principle, and I have these 3 examples, and I'm going to write about that. So it's really important to have a really solid outline before you even start to write. But
how does that outlining work? That process of outlining work for you?
It's painful. I'm not gonna lie, because I like to rip. Like, you and I put this together. I'm like, I don't want to look at the questions you're going to ask me. Let's just talk. And I write like that. Let's just talk. But it doesn't always work out like we hope. So I have to sit down, and sometimes I'll sit at my chair and I'll just type up the outline and just say what makes sense. And it takes a while, maybe, a couple of days, to really come up with a solid outline.
Mm-hmm.
But
so,
yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to go back to your question. The reason why the platform is so important is, when you're promoting your book, because you've committed to do that, you have to have people who are actually going to help you. And I hope all of you will help me with my book, Can We Talk, and go on to LinkedIn and mention, hey, I got to hear this great author, Roberta Matchison, an expert on talent, and she's got a new book out. You guys should buy it, whatever. That's the kind of thing you need to have. And if you don't have any friends or followers, it's kind of hard, right, when you're putting your messaging out.
Have you been asked to do any more what we think of as traditional author promotion, like book signings and those kinds of things? Are those things you need to do if you're commercially published to get your book moving and sold?
Well, let me see. I did my first book signing for Suddenly in Charge in Paris, and there was a long line. It was my family. Okay. Because that's not how it works unless you're Daniel Steele. You don't get sent out on a book tour. And so I took pictures of the bookstore, and I went in and I signed my books for them. and my family was there. Most recently, I was in Croatia and Italy, and I did an international book tour. And I took my book and I took photos of me and my book because it had just come out in all these, wonderful locations. So some of it is a bit of marketing and smoke and mirrors, right? And other parts are, yes, if somebody invited me, what you have to be willing to do is sometimes give up some income. So if someone invites me to speak and, I have a speaker fee, I will say, well, if you buy this many books, I will, either, speak for a reduced rate or speak for free. Because for me, I would rather have 200 people in the audience have a copy of my book than money in my bank account, because those people are going to go back to their organization and say, we heard this great speaker, or this woman had some really interesting ideas, we should bring her in. And that's where you have to it's this balance between what your publisher wants you to do, which is sell books, and what you want to do, which is get business. Well, at least for me.
So what are the ways in which you've been able to use your books as a platform for your business?
Well, I get hired as a speaker because everybody wants an author. When you go to these conferences, this person's the author of this book. And so that's why I keep publishing. And oftentimes a company will bring me in to do leadership development, or someone will hire me as their executive coach because I wrote the book on this topic. And so, those sort of things will happen, but they take time. So I'll give you an example. I did an author dinner for Get Abstract, and Get Abstract does, like bite-sized learning. And a woman flew in from Detroit who worked for General Motors to come to the dinner. And she came to that dinner because she was invited and she had read Suddenly in Charge and she loved that book. She didn't come because of my next book. And she absolutely had to meet me, which was awesome because then I started to work with General Motors. That never would have happened if I hadn't written the first book. So sometimes you don't even know where your success is going to come from.
That's a great story. I love the connection between the first book and the second book, and the interest in attending as a result of work you'd already done. So
Right.
it sounds like it continues to perpetuate opportunities for you even years down the road.
So an example of that is I'm a LinkedIn Learning author, and I have 8 courses on the LinkedIn Learning platform. And that happened because I was an author, right? And they liked my content and they saw I had a following. And so they're like, we should have you on LinkedIn. And so that has created like a tremendous amount of interest. I think I have like 250,000 followers now on LinkedIn. It just, things start to bubble, right? But again, like if I hadn't written the first book, I would just be probably, I don't know where I'd be.
So tell us about how you actually went in to get that first book. Did you have your agent first, or did you approach a publisher first? What was the sequencing there, and how do those of us who are interested in it develop enough moxie to go in there and say, I want to do this. Let's do this together?
Well, the first book proposal I wrote, I'll be honest with you, took me 3 years to write. Okay. And then it was rejected by this agent. And so, I licked my wounds, and then I came up with this other idea, Suddenly in Charge. And I sent her the proposal and I said, listen, you were generous enough to give me feedback. I appreciated your honesty. I have a new book proposal. Would you look at it? And she said, yes. And then she wrote me back and she said, now this is a book I can sell. That book has sold a lot of copies. So she had it, she saw it, and she's like, this is a book I can sell. But that was 7 years ago. And at that time, I think you maybe had to be able to show you could sell like 5,000 books. So it's definitely gotten harder. But what else she told me, which I thought was very interesting, is that it's easier to get a first book deal than a second book deal, because the numbers that are showing up, those numbers are, they're no secret. It's not a secret. Like, your publisher isn't the only one that knows. All of those numbers go up on BookScan. So if McGraw-Hill is looking at your book, they know you've only sold 1,000 copies. So get your first book deal. But, listen, if you believe in what you're doing and you have a rock solid proposal and you have figured out a way to, monetize and say, here's how I'm going to sell 10,000 books, then, go for it.
That's great.
And some people do go through the agents. Nowadays, you can go direct to Wiley. You can go direct to Career Press. They're not the, they're not the highest tier, but who cares?
Right. If it's out there and it's getting marketed and it's getting promoted and you're selling books, then it's doing the job, it sounds like. Well, thank you so much, Roberta. I would love to turn it over to the audience for some questions for about 10 or 15 minutes. We were having a very lively discussion before we started recording the program. So I'd love to get some of those interesting perspectives and thoughts that Roberta had on those issues and topics presented as well. So if you'd like to just unmute yourself and raise your hand, that would be great. You can raise your hand using the reactions button located on the bottom of your screen. Okay, Amita.
Did you work with the same publisher for all your books?
No, actually. Okay, well, every time I get a book deal, the publisher gets sold. Okay, so like my first two books were with the same publisher, and then they got sold to Hachette or Hachette, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. And then the person who had published, who was the editor on my first book, started her own publishing company. And so I went with her, but then she sold. Okay. And then my last publisher, it wasn't, going to be the right fit for this book. And so now I'm with a different publisher. So I think out of the 6 books I've had 4 publishers.
It sounds like we need to find out who you're publishing with, go out and buy stock in that business, because they're likely to be acquired.
Absolutely. I mean, I joke around and I'm like, you're not going to leave me, are you? And even the owner, she's like, no, of course I'm not. And then I'm like, my book is getting ready to come out. And she's like, oh, we're selling the company.
Oh, goodness. Any other questions for Roberta? Okay, Janice.
Hi, thank you so much. This is very interesting. My background is in communications. I have had several experiences, and I have sort of 2-part question. One is on the business platform, coming out with what your views are. Many of my stories are confidential, and I work for some very major organizations. Some pretty exciting things have happened, a lot of leadership opportunities to explore. So I guess my question is, how do you keep that confidentiality? How do you tell those stories without putting people in a difficult situation? And secondly, on a personal side, I'm also looking at that fiction piece of this, and also have sources that have very interesting stories, but they have the concerns of the same thing. I don't want these connections and your name to ever get back to what I did. So do you come up with a different author's name, or do you just, how do you preserve that integrity of those relationships and those confidential situations?
Well, it's easy. You mask it, right? So instead of, maybe your client was a female and you're like, you make that person a male. Maybe you're talking about something that happened when you were head of HR in a tech company. And now you might say, a colleague of mine who was head of HR in a manufacturing company had this happen to her. Right. And you just kind of mash it up and mix things up so that it's not, so somebody might say to you, wow, that was really interesting. I read your book and it sounded like the situation we had, and your response is, wow, I get a lot of that. A lot of people say that,
That
right?
would be my biggest concern. And that's great advice. That's great advice. But that would be my biggest concern.
And then when I'm quoting people, the publisher will have you have to get an agreement from them, a release. And so they know up front. Now, a lot of the people in Can We Talk, it's not a lot, but a number of the people who gave me their stories, they did not want to be named, and it just says anonymous.
Mhm.
That's all. Everybody else has names, and underneath their story, it says anonymous, which I'm fine with.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So Roberta, I actually have a follow-up question to that, coming from the legal side of my brain. When you are drafting your consulting agreements now with clients, is there any language or information you've included in your agreements that would permit you to utilize and disclose not the names, not the name, rank, and serial number of the people involved, but the general gist of what work you're doing with them?
Well, I don't divulge what work I'm doing with them. And let's face it, people are people, and the problems that they're experiencing, they're happening everywhere. So you can't tell me that you're talking about my company. Like, no, everybody's got poor managers. Like, you're not alone, trust me. So again, I mean, I'm respectful. If it completely, like if I described a company like it's a travel company and it's got, 3 billion in revenue and they happen to be headquartered in Massachusetts, I mean, I would never do that. But I think there are enough examples that are in the public square, right? You can take examples like, well, this just happened, in Bloomberg, they just noted this, right? That's free to use.
That's a great idea as well. Utilize things that are already in the public domain, because you can analyze and apply information to that without having to worry about that blowback potentially from clients. That's a great piece of advice. Any other questions? We have about 2 minutes for questions, and if not, we're going to move on to some key takeaways for the day. All right, great. So Roberta, I'm going to ask you 3 questions to sort of finalize and wrap up what we've been talking about. And the first is, if you were going back before you wrote your very first book, what would you do differently?
Well, I wouldn't spend 3 years writing a book proposal. I would have just gotten it done. I would have sucked it up and said, okay, she didn't like your first proposal. You know how to do this. And what's interesting is my agent actually, a major publisher came to her and said, we'd like a book on a particular topic. And I put that proposal together in a weekend. So 3 years or a weekend, right? So how serious are you really about this?
So looking back at that weekend, how did that, you had the request to put something together and you got it done in a weekend. How did you manage to get that level of detail and specificity that you had been struggling with for 3 years into that one weekend? What's the difference between those two processes for you?
Well, it's sort of like a resume. When you take the time to develop a solid resume, you just knock down like the last job and you would layer on a new job. So I had a lot of the platform, right? And so then I'd fill in. Since then, I was on the O'Reilly Factor and I was quoted in the Wall Street Journal. So I was able to layer on top of that and make my focus, okay, here's the structure of the book. Here are the chapters. Here's what it's going to look like. So, a lot of the hard work in the beginning was done, but of course I had to refresh it. And you have to submit a sample chapter. So I had to write 24 pages, double spaced, to send off to say, here's a sample of what this would look like.
Sounds like that was a weekend without very much sleep.
Honestly, for me, it wasn't, because I was excited. I was like, this was a big publisher. And then the ironic thing is, when they got the proposal, the editor who my agent said, well, she's young, whatever that means, was like, well, this topic isn't really that exciting, right? She asked for the topic. Ironically, the topic was on managing remote workers. Not very exciting at the time. And so then they were going to look for somebody who had a big name and probably use a ghostwriter. So, and I don't do ghostwriting. It's way too much work to write a book and then like not have any credit.
That makes perfect sense. Have you been asked to do that in the past, or is that something
Yes.
that, okay. And how does that happen? If you are asked to ghostwrite a book, is that an approach that comes from a publisher, an agent?
It came from my agent and I turned it down. Like, no,
Mhm.
like, I'm not writing for this psychiatrist, this book on this topic, and then I'm not getting any credit. I don't care how much you pay me. It's not my thing. I think you have to know what your thing is.
Right. That makes sense. So the next question I'd like to ask you is, what's the biggest surprise to you from the book writing process? What's the biggest unknown when you went into all of this and you look back on it now and you say, what is it that really sort of surprised or shocked you about the process or the writing itself?
Well, honestly, the biggest thing that surprised me and still surprises me, and I'm working on not showing it, is when somebody that I'm talking with, when they find out who I am, they're like, oh, I read your book. And I'm always like, really? Like, like that's not really what I'm going for. So I have to kind of step back and go, oh, I'm delighted to hear that. But I'm always like, oh my God, they actually read it. Like, this is so cool. So I'm also surprised. I have actually, a colleague of mine had a job interview in like the Bahamas, and he walked into the head of HR's office and he was quoted in my book. And there was my book sitting on her desk. And he took the book and he's like, see this? Like, I'm in this book. So your book shows up in places like you're like, oh my God, like I can't imagine like how it got there. So that's fun. But about the writing process, I think I was really surprised that when writing is like exercising. The more you exercise, the stronger you get. And, the fact that I can write as rapidly as I can, it's because I'm constantly using that muscle. And so I can put together like a 700-word article in like 20 minutes because I've been doing it for so long, like I know how it works. And so for those of you who are like, oh, I could never do that, I'm just going to tell you to just start writing, like write a blog post, like do that every day or every other day and just start writing, and you'll see like there'll be a pattern in your writing and you'll just get quicker and quicker and quicker and better.
So before we move on to my last sort of takeaway question, are there any book ideas that you're sort of mulling over right now? And I know you just had one come out, but you say you like to flex your writing muscles. Are you flexing them in a particular direction these days, or are you giving them a little bit of a vacation?
Well, right now, I don't have another idea and I don't have another proposal out because, as we were talking about earlier, I have to maximize this book and optimize it for me, because that's my goal, right? Is to get it in the hands of buyers. So if you know anyone who could use the book, can we talk? Let me know. But I have to get it into their hands. And I'm really great at writing, and I can use that as an excuse. I could just sit here and go, well, I'm just going to spend this time writing a proposal rather than I need to get out and get that book into your hands. And so what's the point of me writing this if no one reads it because nobody knows about it because I haven't marketed it? So I'm really focused on the marketing. This time I've invested heavily. I hired a PR firm. I've never done that before. I had a web team put up like pages for the book. I hired a social media team. I went big. I've never done that before.
What differences are you noticing in the first 6 weeks of post-release, having put that team together compared to the times where you haven't?
Well, yesterday I was asked to write an article for HBR. I've tried to get into HBR for a long time, and I haven't been able to. So, that just popped. And I'm being asked to be on podcasts, and people are noticing my work. And, I'm getting a lot more requests through my websites to have conversations with me about my executive coaching and things like that. So I am definitely seeing activity. And so, but it's not cheap. And it's really funny because every time I write a book, my husband looks at me and he's like, oh God, like, how much is this going to cost us? And another thing that you all ought to know, when you do have a commercially published book deal, nowadays, they're asking you to buy either 200 copies or 500 copies. And you will get a reduced price, but that's a lot of books. So if you're like me and you live in a condo, like, good luck.
That is a lot of books. I'm trying to think of my book space, and I don't know that my shelves would hold 500.
That's why I have to get them out.
Well, we will definitely see what we can do to help you with that, because the subject matter is wonderful. It's really coming from the perspective of a mediator who handles employment law situations on a regular basis. I can't tell you how many people should read this book, because it's truly a lost art, or I shouldn't even say a lost art. It's an art that people don't understand, and having those conversations is so important. So I'd like to end today's session with you having us tell us, what's the greatest lesson that you've learned about yourself through this whole process of becoming an author, a multiple book author? And, it sounds like you're constantly learning and evolving in this process. What's the greatest lesson that you have learned?
That I can do this. I mean, I say to friends and people, like, I wasn't in high school or junior high, like, nobody ever said to me, oh, you should be a writer. Like, your writing is so good. Like, no one ever said that. And, some people know that, right? They're told at a young age, like, you have a real, like my daughter, her writing is exquisite. I don't know how that happened, and I don't say that lightly, but her writing is exquisite. I never was like that. And so just like some of you who, maybe you weren't athletic in high school, but now you play a pretty good game of tennis or pickleball or whatever. Like, I discovered there's something that I'm really, really good at. And, that makes me feel good. And if you're thinking about doing it, I would just encourage you to just go for it, because who knows, like, I could be calling you in, 4 years time and asking for your advice because you've written, 3 books already.
So Roberta, if people are interested in learning more about Can We Talk or about your other books, where's the best place for them to go?
Well, they can come to my website, matchesonconsulting.com. They can go onto Amazon. They can go on to Goodreads, Barnes and Noble. And, if you do download the book, what's really helpful for us authors, notice how I said us, is leaving a review, because, man, it's like pulling teeth to get those reviews. Even if people love your book, they're all like, yeah, I'll write a review. But it's just like, just leave a 3 or 4 sentence review, and hopefully you'll like the book. And if you don't, then let's talk.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Roberta, for joining us today and sharing your wisdom and your advice on the process of writing a book, and giving hopefully a lot of us some inspiration to get out there and read that book on book proposals, make sure we know what we're doing before we put it out there, and get to work. We hope you've enjoyed our program today, and hope that you will join us on Friday, January 14th at 1 p.m. to learn from Rachel Rice about reinventing your career path. She's done so not once, but twice, and it promises to be a really exciting situation and discussion. So with that, I will pause the recording. Thank you very much, and we will perhaps have a minute or two for informal discussion. Have a wonderful day to everyone.
Thank you so